Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing titled EPA's IRIS program evaluating the science and process behind chemical risk assessment. You'll find in front of you packets containing our witness panel's written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosure. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning. I want to welcome our witnesses here today. This hearing continues the committee's work on EPA's Integrated Risk and Information System, or IRIS. The committee has held a number of hearings over the past few years on IRIS's ability to produce risk assessments associated with exposure to chemicals. In 2009, GAO placed the program on its high-risk series because the EPA was unable to complete timely, credible chemical assessments or decrease its backlog of ongoing assessments. Over the last decade, the IRIS program has gone through a number of changes, particularly to the process by which its assessments are reviewed. These changes were meant to address the inappropriate influence of the White House, regulated agencies, and industry on the IRIS process, the argument being that these entities were preventing assessments from being finalized. Despite these changes, the process implemented by EPA in 2009 still allows for White House input, and the program still has a backlog of over 70 assessments, unchanged from the previous administration. While EPA seems to be taking steps to adopt the recommendations of GAO regarding outside review, they have uniformly ignored the recommendations of another body, the National Academy of Sciences. For several years now, they too have offered recommendations related to IRIS. These recommendations, however, did not focus on the review process, but rather on how EPA develops the draft assessments in the first place. Time and time again, draft assessments were sent to the NAS for review, only to be severely criticized. Rather than adopting the recommendations of the Academy and updating their processes, EPA continued to churn out assessments that were summarily rebuked. As I stated in our 2009 hearing, the competing priorities of issuing assessments in a timely manner and producing assessments that are scientifically credible are central to the problems that we face today. That statement remains just as true today as it did 2 years ago. Up until now, EPA has blamed outside forces for the failures of the program. In reality, they too are to blame. The program's credibility is threatened when it continually puts forth assessments that fail to address fundamental issues raised by reviewers. If, as the old adage goes, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, then this program needs some therapy. Adopting the NAS recommendations is the first step to restoring the program's credibility. EPA's announcement 2 days ago is a step in the right direction, but the program's success hinges on its implementation. As the Academy noted in its formaldehyde report, many of the concepts and approaches they recommended are elementary and already exist in EPA's guidelines. They went on to state, quote, "The current state of the formaldehyde draft IRIS assessment suggests that there might be a problem with the practical implementation of the guidelines in completing the IRIS assessments," unquote. Following through is the key here. It is up to the EPA to not only adopt the NAS recommendations, but to also follow its own existing guidelines. This committee will continue its oversight of the IRIS program to ensure that EPA not only adopts the NAS recommendations, but that it follows guidelines already in existence and continually seeks to employ the most modern, credible methods and protocols to assess chemical risk. I have a lot of questions about this program and where it is headed. As GAO stated in their testimony in 2009, quote, "EPA needs to hold itself more accountable to the public and Congress for carrying out this important component of its mission. especially since the IRIS program is discretionary, unquote. As a physician myself, I understand the stakes that we're dealing with, particularly with sensitive populations such as children, pregnant women, and the elderly. I want to make sure that they are protected from undue harm. I'm also aware of the damage caused by overly conservative measures that scare our citizens without reason, ultimately doing nothing to advance safety. The opening line of the NAS report, titled Science and Decisions, stated, quote, virtually every aspect of life involves risk, unquote. It is how we assess and manage that risk that ensures our safety. Now I recognize the ranking member from Maryland for her opening statement. I recognize Ms. Edwards for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. For 50 years, the tobacco industry has waged an organized campaign to cast doubt on the health risks of smoking cigarettes. They invented the effort to use science to fight science, to harness industry-funded research in public relations efforts, and to use friendly public officials and fora to point to these manufactured uncertainties in opposing any effort to protect the public. During that entire time, public health experts have known absolutely that smoking causes cancer, and that smoking remains, in the words of the Surgeon General, quote, the single most important preventable cause of death in our society. This model of industry-funded science being used to generate uncertainty and postpone even minor regulatory steps, regardless of the effects on public health, and repeated with gusto by other industries. A similar campaign is being waged by the fossil fuel industry to cast doubt on the science of climate change. And today we're going to see some of this unfolding surrounding EPA's science-based efforts to develop risk assessments related to health consequences of chemicals that Americans are exposed to commonly. Industry tends to push for two things in the realm of science and regulation. First, they demand that we must have certainty before any action can be taken. And second, they point to studies that suggest there is uncertainty. What they don't mention quite so prominently is that the industry funds the production of studies designed to sow doubt. That manufactured doubt is then used to justify inaction because obviously there is no certainty. The result is gridlock. The country ends up in an endless loop of science research that's expensive and counterproductive, and making it almost impossible to ever make a statement about the harm of anything. With enough money and enough willing researchers, there's always money and there are always willing payees. Industry can be certain that there's always another study just around the corner, no matter the chemical or the consensus regarding its harm with the industry, generally hoping that the study will show no harm. In this world, the scientists being paid, say, $325 an hour, by the way, who work for industry, are not working to understand a problem, but to provide answers that their clients want to use for their public relations campaigns. In 1983, the National Academy of Sciences issued a Red Book on risk assessment. For almost 3 decades, that's been the Bible on how to conduct a risk assessment. The report was motivated in part by a desire to try to set the science of assessing risk outside the political environment that surrounded decisions about what to do about those risks. But deep pockets readily used the report to see science as a fertile ground for fighting regulation. Industry learned that they can forestall any movement out of the realm of risk assessment and into the realm of risk management by manufacturing doubt, a process institutionalized by the NAS book, not by NAS, but by those who used it. Now the Academy has marched again into a situation that they may not have fully anticipated. The NAS report on EPA's draft formaldehyde assessment contains a very useful roadmap for how EPA should undertake reorganizing their IRIS assessments to make them more comprehensible and transparent. And though Dr. Anastas has embraced those recommendations, the industries that most worry about IRIS assessments have seized on the language of the NAS report to try to claim that EPA cannot be trusted to do the science. That is not the message of the NAS report, nor the intention of the Academy panel. Under the Bush administration that so crippled the EPA through a broken program with interference by OMB, that agency was able to finalize only a couple of IRIS assessments a year. EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson put in place a new process that severely cut back on OMB and polluting agency interference. So today we're going to hear from industry prescribers that go back to this kind of OMB-dominated system. in which there's a suggestion that no assessment can ever be finalized without the Academy peer review of the draft assessment and then another peer review of the redrafted assessment. Instead, I suggest that we follow the National Academy's advice. Allow the EPA the time to institute the kind of changes proposed in the formaldehyde review. Dr. Anastas has already proposed an initiative tied to the Academy roadmap that appears to be responsive and robust. It seems clear to me that to allow EPA to do their job with the advice from the Academy and not get captured by the endless science of the doubt machine is the direction that we should go. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today to cast light on this process and to ensure that we have agencies that are actually working in the public interest and not in the private interest. Thank you, and I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. Now, before we begin, let me note that, again, testimony from EPA was not received within the time frame established in our committee rules. The testimony was not received until 2:47 p.m. yesterday, with additional supplements trickling in at 5:45 p.m. yesterday. Committee Rule 7B1 states that, quote, insofar as is practicable, no later than 48 hours in advance of his or her appearance, each witness who is to appear before the committee shall file in printed copy and in electronic form a written statement of his or her proposed testimony and the curriculum vitae. Late testimony inhibits the committee's ability to fully evaluate the matter before it. Late delivery of testimony could set the stage for the committee to refuse to accept the written testimony of or hear from a witness. In this instance, it is imperative that EPA testify. But EPA has once again obstructed the committee's ability to conduct legitimate oversight. EPA provided late testimony to the FY12 budget hearing on March 10th, late testimony to the May 11th hearing on hydraulic fracturing, and late testimony for the E15 hearing on July the 7th. Additionally, questions for the record from the FY12 budget hearing were due on March 24th, yet the committee only received responses 2 days ago, almost 4 months late. This is intolerable. The committee provided EPA a heads up on this hearing almost 2 months ago, providing ample time for OMB to review EPA's testimony. Dr. Anastas, this is unacceptable, and I expect EPA's testimony to be on time so that this committee can execute its responsibilities. And I hope in the future that we can count on you to do so and other officials with EPA to do so, and I'd appreciate a very prompt response to a request. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first panel of witnesses. Dr. Paul Anastas, Assistant Administrator for the Office of Research and Development at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. David Trimble is the Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Dr. Jonathan Samet, is that correct? Samet, okay. Samet, MD, served as Chair of the National Research Council's Committee to review EPA's draft IRIS assessment of formaldehyde. Dr. Samet also previously chaired the National Research Council's Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology, where he evaluated the EPA's reassessment of dioxin and related compounds. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. Your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. It is the practice of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight to receive testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objection to taking an oath? Let the record reflect that all witnesses are willing to take an oath. They indicated that by shaking their head from side to side, even though we heard no rattles. I saw it. Y'all may also be represented by counsel. Do any of y'all have counsel here today? Y'all is Southern for you all. Let the record reflect that none of the witnesses have counsel. They again indicated by the shake of their head indicating no. If all of you would now please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that all witnesses participating have taken the oath. Please take your seat. Now I recognize our first witness, Dr. Anastas.
Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Edwards, and other members of the committee. I'm Paul Anastas. I am the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Research and Development at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the agency's Science Advisor. Before I begin, let me make a personal statement to this committee. I think this committee appreciates the amount of respect that I have for this committee, and I want to give a personal apology for this committee for the tardiness of today's testimony. I do believe it was prepared promptly, and my apologies for the clearance process that may have delayed that. So that is something that I think is that is important and that I take seriously personally.
Accepted, and I greatly appreciate that. And we look forward to having the testimony presented in a timely manner in the future. Thank you, and I'm going to expect that, and I think you're a man of your word, and I appreciate that assurance that we can have that. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be with you here today to discuss the EPA Integrated Risk Information System, otherwise known as IRIS. EPA plays a critical role in providing high-quality health information on chemicals of concern. The agency's IRIS assessment program is a key part of this effort and includes human health assessments on more than 540 chemical substances. These assessments provide the sound scientific basis for EPA decisions and are widely used by risk assessors, health professionals, state and local governments, as well as international governments. EPA is committed to upholding the highest standard of scientific integrity in all of its activities. This means constantly seeking to improve, strengthen, and enhance our scientific work to reflect the best available information. Continuous improvement of the IRIS program is an important part of this effort. EPA recently announced changes to the IRIS program that will ensure we continue to use the best and most transparent science to pursue our mission of protecting human health and the environment. The new changes build upon the significant improvements initiated by Administrator Lisa Jackson in 2009. For example, since 2009, EPA has completed 16 IRIS assessments, more than the total number of assessments that were completed in the previous 4 years. We've cut down the average time frame for completing assessments from between 3 and 4 years to within 2 years, and reduced the backlog of assessments in the pipeline. And yes, new assessments have been added to that pipeline, so that may be why the number looks to be the same. These improvements have been accompanied by a strong and continued emphasis on independent peer review of the IRIS program. In April of this year, EPA received a report from the National Academy of Sciences on their review of EPA's draft IRIS assessment on formaldehyde. EPA welcomes and accepts the recommendations of the NAS on the formaldehyde assessment and will incorporate these recommendations in the revision of the assessment. In the report, the NAS also suggested ways to improve the IRIS process in 2 primary areas: accessibility and transparency. Because EPA is constantly seeking feedback from credible, independent scientific sources, we welcome these suggestions and are incorporating them fully into the IRIS program. The new IRIS assessment documents will be shorter, clearer, more concise, and more transparent. IRIS users can expect to see a reduced volume of text and increased clarity and transparency of data, methods, and decision criteria. IRIS documents will rigorously be edited to eliminate any inconsistencies and redundancies and will include more graphical and tabular representations of the data. Related discussions will be consolidated into concise narrative descriptions, and references to all studies used in the assessment development will be posted online. To make the scientific rationale of IRIS assessments as transparent as possible, EPA will evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of critical studies in a more uniform way. We will also clearly indicate which criteria were most influential in weighing scientific evidence, supporting its choice of toxicity values. EPA is working closely with the agency's Science Advisory Board to focus its expertise on how to best respond to the NIS suggestions. In addition, we continue to be committed to full consultation with scientists throughout the government and carefully consider and respond to their input. We will add a peer consultation step to the early stages of major IRIS assessments to assure that the scientific community can provide input as we make critical design decisions for individual assessments. These changes will be implemented over the coming months in a tiered approach, with the most extensive changes applied to those assessments in the earliest stages of development. These improvements are part of the natural evolution that accompanies all rigorous scientific work. We will continue to consider information and perspectives from independent scientific sources and pursue improvements on an ongoing basis. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time as the Chair directs.
Thank you, Dr. Nestis. Now recognize our next witness, Mr. Trimble.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Edwards, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to be here today to discuss our prior work and recommendations on EPA's Integrated Risk Information System. As you know, the IRIS database contains the EPA's scientific position on the potential human health effects of exposure to more than 540 chemicals in the environment. IRIS assessments are a critical component of EPA's capacity to support scientifically sound risk management decisions, policies, and regulations. In March 2008, we reported that the IRIS program was at serious risk of becoming obsolete because the agency has not been able to complete timely, credible chemical assessments or decrease its backlog of 70 ongoing assessments. We found that the timeframes for completing assessments were unacceptably long, often taking over a decade. In many cases, assessments became obsolete before they could be finalized and were stuck in an endless loop of assessment and reassessment. In April 2008, EPA revised the IRIS process, but the changes made were not responsive to our recommendations. The new process was actually worse than the one it replaced, institutionalizing a process that resulted in frequent delays by enabling OMB to determine when an IRIS assessment could move forward. Further, this process effectively excluded the content of OMB's comments to EPA and those from other interested federal agencies from the public record. Concerned with these problems and the agency's lack of responsiveness, we added EPA's process for assessing and controlling toxic chemicals to our January 2009 report on government-wide high-risk areas in need of increased attention by executive agencies and Congress. In May 2009, EPA made significant changes to the IRIS process. In June of that year, we testified before this subcommittee that these changes, if implemented and managed effectively, would be largely responsive to the recommendations we made in our March 2008 report. Let me highlight three of these key changes. First, the IRIS process would be managed by EPA rather than OMB as the former process was, restoring independence to EPA. Second, it required that all written comments provided by OMB and other federal agencies on draft IRIS assessments be part of the public record, adding transparency and credibility to the process. Third, the new procedures consolidated and eliminated steps, streamlining the process. Notably, the new process eliminated the step under which other federal agencies could have IRIS assessments suspended indefinitely to conduct additional research. As we have reported, we understand that there may be exceptional circumstances under which it may be appropriate to wait for the results of an important ongoing study. However, as a general rule, we believe the IRIS assessments that are based on the best available science is a standard that would best support the goal of completing assessments within reasonable time periods and minimizing the need to conduct wasteful rework. While the May 2009 IRIS process changes reflect a significant improvement that can help EPA restore the integrity and productivity of the IRIS program, EPA still faces significant management challenges as it seeks to complete timely, credible IRIS assessments. First, EPA must continue to balance the need for using the best available science with completing IRIS assessments in a timely manner. As we have reported, even one delay can have a domino effect, requiring the process to essentially be repeated to incorporate changing science. Second, EPA faces long-standing difficulties in completing assessments of chemicals of key concerns, those that are both widespread and likely to cause significant health issues. We believe that EPA must continue to focus on the best available science, obtaining credible expert review, and finalizing IRIS assessments. Third, EPA must be disciplined in keeping to timelines, even in the absence of fixed statutory deadlines for completing IRIS assessments. Lastly, we believe that to produce timely, credible IRIS assessments over a sustained period of time, it will be imperative for EPA to maintain a stable, consistent process going forward. We are currently reviewing EPA's implementation of its revised 2009 IRIS assessment process and its response to our previous recommendations. As part of this review, we will be examining EPA's response to NAS's recommendations for improvements to the IRIS process. We plan to issue a report later this year. That concludes the summary of my statement. I'll be happy to answer any questions you or members of the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Trimble. I now recognize for 5 minutes our next witness, Dr. Samet.
All right, okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I'm Jonathan Samet from the University of Southern California. As noted, I chaired the National Research Council committee that reviewed the EPA's draft IRIS formaldehyde assessment. I also currently chair the Clean Air Scientific Advisor Committee of the agency. The draft, our review of the draft assessment was written by a 15-member committee that had a wide range of scientific expertise needed for the task. Our charge focused primarily on specific questions related to the agency's approach to the IRIS assessment. But beyond these charge questions, the committee assessed the processes underlying the development of the draft and made suggestions about the process generally followed by EPA in developing the IRIS assessments. We are not charged or constituted to carry out an independent review of the evidence on formaldehyde. To do its job, we reviewed the 1,000-page approximately draft assessment and key literature and determined whether EPA's conclusions were supported on the basis of that assessment and the literature reviewed. Much of our report is directed at providing constructive comments and recommendations on improving this draft specifically following our charge. That said, we felt that we could not address our charge without considering the methods and structure of the document as a whole, and in responding to its charge questions, the committee found some recurring methodological problems that cut across components of its charge. Consequently, we commented on the general methodology of the assessment in our second chapter and offered general suggestions in Chapter 7 with regard to the processes used by EPA. The general problems that we identified were not unique and have been reported by other committees. I think those problems have already received some comment. We found relatively little documentation of methods and insufficient clarity and transparency in how the evidence reviewed in the report was related back to the weight of evidence guidelines. We offered 6 specific recommendations with regard to how the present draft could be completed and moved forward satisfactorily. I will not go through these. They're listed in Chapter 7 of our report. They are straightforward and could be followed to bring the report to completion. I'll turn to our general comments and suggestions on IRIS. As noted, we found general problems that we thought had been persistent in looking at NRC reviews of other IRIS reports. On the basis of lessons learned from the formaldehyde assessment, we offered our suggestions for changes in the IRIS development process that might help EPA improve its approach. We recognize that EPA had already implemented the plan discussed and released and covered in the memorandum of 2009 from Administrator Jackson. We put together our own view of the underlying development process and offered a several-page roadmap for changes in the development process. The term roadmap was used because the topics that need to be addressed are set out, but we did not give detailed guidance. Each topic, in fact, would need to be developed in further detail. For each of the critical steps in the roadmaps, there are underlying processes that would need to be examined and reconsidered. Our report provides further detail. We think that change in the IRIS development process, the process by which the drafts are developed, is feasible. We note as one example the largely successful overhaul of the process used for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards as an example. I have personally watched the revision of that process and noted its benefits. In conclusion, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
I want to thank the panel, all of y'all, for reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes each. The chair at this point will open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. EPA announced changes to the IRIS process 2 days ago. In that announcement, EPA indicated that it had signed an MOU with the California Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment in order to cooperate in the development of health assessments to encourage data sharing and avoid duplication of effort. Dr. Nastas, as a Georgian, why should I be subject to California's risk assessments? If states are doing this work, why do we need IRIS? If IRIS assessments are better than state assessment, why have California do assessments for EPA? If IRIS isn't sufficient, why not rely on one own state assessment? Right? Just why rely on one own state assessment? Please explain this to me. Why this isn't a backdoor attempt to implement California's risk assessment policies on the rest of the nation. Dr. Nastas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy that you asked that question because it gives the opportunity to explain some misconceptions about what IRIS is. IRIS assessments are not risk assessments. They are not risk management actions. They are not regulations. They are scientific assessments to understand the hazard, the underlying toxicity of substances. So the information that would be being shared between California and EPA is simply the underlying scientific basis, the assessments that are done by using the open scientific literature. That is the basis of the science. But in no way would these assessments be risk assessments, California risk assessments, California regulations. These are only the underlying scientific basis that would be shared and the basis of these health hazard assessments.
Well, I've got some follow-up questions that I'll give you in writing to go forward, but just in the sake of time, Dr. Samet, as chair of the National Research Council committee that reviewed the EPA's draft IRIS assessment of formaldehyde, the committee decided to devote an entire chapter entitled Roadmap for Revision that highlighted specific changes to improve the formaldehyde IRIS assessment, but also went a step further and offered recommendation for improving the IRIS process in general. Why did the committee decide to offer additional recommendations to improve the IRIS process? And what letter grade would you give EPA for its formaldehyde assessment? A being excellent and F being a failure. And how about for the 4 other assessments that NAS has reviewed since 2005?
The committee in its Chapter 7 wanted to give very specific guidance to the agency on how to bring the formaldehyde assessment to completion. That was the 6 recommendations. The document, the draft assessment, involves a number of underlying processes that have a generality to them, pulling together all the evidence, reviewing it, and evaluating it. And as we looked at the assessment, we found weaknesses which we documented in how those processes had put into place and carried out. We felt that it was important to give the specific suggestions, but also to provide general guidance on what needed to be done to help improve not only this IRIS assessment, but hopefully future ones. As you noted, the National Research Council has reviewed other major IRIS assessments in the last decade and found deficiencies in those documents. Now, I will say the committee was not asked to give a letter grade. I certainly couldn't give an A. I probably would be, Paul, sorry, a little pressed to give a B, and let's say we'd certainly we'll give a passing grade here, and I'm not sure, and if I give a too low a grade, I know they'll come back and ask me to revise it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Samet. My time's just about expired, so I'll recognize Ms. Edwards for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses this morning. Dr. Samet, your panel laid out certain challenges for EPA to take up to make the formaldehyde assessment stronger. Your panel did not recommend, however, that EPA bring that revised assessment back to the Academy for another round of review, but to finish it and finalize it. Do you have confidence that EPA can successfully address the issues raised by your panel regarding how to strengthen and clarify the formaldehyde assessment?
So as a first comment, of course, an Academy panel can't recommend that something be brought back to the Academy, and I think, however the document is revised, I suspect that EPA will undertake further review. I think we were careful in Chapter 7 to say specifically what should be done. These changes, as I noted in my testimony, should be feasible, and they are changes that and revisions that the agency should be able to make successfully.
And Dr. Anastas, do you have confidence that you'll be able to make that assessment given the analysis by the Academy?
Yes. I think the important thing is we seek out the type of input that we received from the national academies, that we seek out from scientific experts, and we're very confident that getting the kind of input, the kind of recommendations, that we're able to follow through and incorporate those suggestions.
Thank you. And to follow on then, Dr. Samet, the subcommittee has received some testimony for this hearing that suggests that the Academy should review every IRIS assessment, then review every revised assessment after changes are made following the NAS report. Would this be a difficult thing for the Academy to take on? And what effort would it require to review 20 IRIS assessments a year?
Well, certainly I'm now speaking as chair of the committee and not in general for the academies, which I can't do. I think there are many ways to have successful peer review, the Science Advisory Board of the EPA, which I serve on, being one, the Academy being another. I will say that now speaking individually, the effort involved in completing this review was substantial. This, as I mentioned, 15-member committee of volunteers working in 4 meetings in 8 months and producing a report over 100 pages. So substantial effort would be involved, and I think if the full load of peer review were somehow placed before the Academy, I'm certain that that would stress the community of scientists who carry out such reviews.
Yes, I suspect that would be pretty impracticable. I wonder, Dr. Samet, you also provided a roadmap for EPA on how you think the IRIS process could be improved, and your panel apparently believed that EPA is actually capable of implementing those changes that the agency decides make sense. As chair of the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee at EPA, you've had such changes take place in the, I'll just use the acronym, in the NACS process, and also as chair of CASAC, and those assessment processes. Are there lessons that might be learned here for IRIS?
Well, I think if you look at Chapter 7 of our report, we provide a case study of the revisions that were made, and having participated in reviews of NAC standards now for several decades, I think the process has become much clearer, much more transparent, and much more efficient. And I think it has worked. It took some time on the part of the agency and some interactions with CASAC, but I think an improved process resulted.
And I just want to be clear, your report contained examples of where your panel felt that the EPA got the science wrong or failed to adequately communicate how they evaluated studies and came to conclusions, but I couldn't find any place where you imply that EPA purposefully distorted the science or their findings. Did you find any evidence at all of purposeful deception or intentional manipulation on the part of EPA?
Well, certainly, as we addressed our charge, we looked carefully at how studies were selected and reviewed. I think we certainly found many examples where we felt the EPA had not communicated well or we could not follow their methodology, but nothing that I would regard as purposeful, to use your words.
Thank you. And then lastly, we'll hear testimony today that argues that the Science Advisory Board lacks independence because it depends on EPA staff. Doesn't the CASAC also depend on EPA staff for its work?
Well, CASAC certainly is supported by EPA staff. Our deliberations and discussions are fully public, and I certainly don't see them as influenced by EPA staff as we carry them out in the complete open.
Does either KSAC or the the advisory board have? Do you have any reason to believe that they lack any kind of independence because they rely somewhat on EPA staff?
Not in my experience, no.
Thank you very much, and with that, I yield.
Going to yield myself 5 minutes for some questions as well. So, Mr. Trimble, if I could start with you, what would it take to remove the IRIS program from GAO's high-risk series?
That's a challenging question. We are in the process of working with the agency and OMB to discuss what sort of steps we would like to see along that process. I think there's no simple answer that's X and Y and Z. I think that we've got a little bit more work to figure out all the steps. Clearly, from our prior work, some of the steps they've taken has moved the ball along in terms of restoring independence, adding some transparency to the process. But clearly a lot of work needs to be done in terms of being able to address the large backlog that still remains, as well as to be able to move ongoing assessments forward in a timely manner. I think there's also the issue that's still lurking out there regarding sort of the pent-up backlog of IRIS assessments that sort of Office of Water and other parts of EPA have not put in requests because they know there's such a logjam currently. So there's a lot of other hidden issues that we haven't addressed yet, but we're in the process of planning work.
Do you have any estimate on timeline on that?
Well, we have meetings scheduled, I believe, this fall with the agency and OMB to sort of do a status report, and you know, I don't have a timeline at this stage.
Okay. Dr. Anastas, let me read one part of Dr. Samet's testimony where he says, in the roughly 1,000-page formaldehyde draft reviewed by the present committee, little beyond a brief 2-page introductory chapter could be found on the methods for conducting the assessment. In fact, the introductory chapter of formaldehyde is nearly identical to that used in the IRIS assessments. Numerous EPA guidelines are cited, but their role in the preparation of the assessment is not clear. In general, the committee found that the draft was not prepared in a consistent fashion. It lacked clear links to an underlying conceptual framework, and it does not contain sufficient documentation on methods and criteria for identifying evidence from epidemiologic and experimental studies, for critically evaluating individual studies, for assessing the weight of evidence, and for selecting studies for derivation of the RFCs and unit risk estimates. The critical summary sections that synthesize the evidence are variable and too often brief or not present, and strength of evidence is not characterized with standardized descriptors. How do you respond to that?
The reason that the Environmental Protection Agency seeks out the type of peer review, expert peer review, from whether it's our Science Advisory Board or the National Academies, is to get that exact type of review, that exact type of input. We take those recommendations extremely seriously. We think that those improvements are absolutely essential to improving and finalizing this draft assessment. That's why we seek it out. That's why we fully accept them. That's why we're integrating them into our revision of the formaldehyde assessment.
So what is your intention, I guess, with it? I mean, this is pretty significant, what they've said, you know, that it sounds like there was a pretty significant failure here in the process. What will happen to address those recognized failures?
I guess I look at it a little bit differently. I view that as a success in the process. We seek out this exact type of peer review in order to continuously improve this draft document. When we write a draft document, we want that type of input so that the final version that gets posted and is available to the American public and beyond is the highest quality. That's why we accept those recommendations, and that's why we'll build them into our revision.
Okay. Dr. Samet, with my last remaining minute here, in her testimony, Ms. Steinzer takes exception to your scolding of EPA staff in the April formaldehyde report by saying, "I wish that the NRC committee had not adopted such a haughty tone in scolding EPA staff." In responding to her observation, can you provide us with some context of how many reviews the Academy has done of other IRIS assessments, and how often you or other chairs repeated the suggestions and recommendations that ultimately led to Chapter 7 of the formaldehyde report?
Well, I guess I had not read the testimony or seen the term scolding. I think that our comments in Chapter 7 are provided as recommendations and as positive help to the agency in trying to improve the process, as Dr. Anastas mentioned. I think probably, and I can look to my left and get a little help, but this is probably the 5th review in the last decade by a National Research Council committee of an IRIS assessment. These have been the larger, more complicated assessments, and I think in all of them there have been one or more general comments about methodology and some specific chapters on aspects of methodology with concerns expressed.
Thank you. My time is up. I yield 5 minutes to Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for stepping forward this morning. I appreciate, Dr. Anastas, the attitude that you have about looking for input from independent sources. That's very important. As a scientist, I appreciate that. And I understand that the Office of Research and Development relies on a board of scientific counselors to help provide an independent evaluation of your programs. That board did an assessment in 2008 and then again in 2010. Later this morning, we're going to hear that the IRS assessments are considered irrelevant and the department weak in science. Can you tell us a little bit about the board and what sort of people serve on it, their independence, and summarize their observations for us, please?
Yes, a number of years ago, we sought to establish the Board of Scientific Counselors to give us independent reviews of our general performance, how we're performing on the wide range of activities that the Office of Research and Development undertakes. Specifically, we asked them to review the IRIS process, and these members, who are of the highest quality from industry, academia, a broad spectrum of people, looked at the IRIS program and gave us tremendous feedback, both constructive recommendations as well as recognizing the strengths of it. Some of the quotes from the Board of Scientific Counselors include, quote, "Internationally, IRIS assessments are considered to be of the highest quality and reliability," end quote. Another quote is, "IRIS assessments are among the most heavily peer-reviewed documents produced by scientists anywhere," end quote. So there are tremendous strengths to the IRIS program, but we also need to recognize that even strong programs can and must improve. I come from Boston, where the Boston Red Sox happen to be in first place right now, but they're always seeking to improve. We will always engage in continuous improvement because that's what scientists do.
Was the board's recommendations, or are their recommendations, aligned more or less with the recommendations from the National Academy?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Samet, why did the National Academy undertake the assessment in the first place, and who paid for that effort?
Well, the National Research Council was asked by the agency to carry out this review. I think there's a somewhat long and complicated history about that request that you're likely aware of, but the support for the review to the academies came from the Environmental Protection Agency.
Did the National Academy feel that their recommendations, or that your recommendations, should be mandatory and enacted by the end of this year? Was that the intent?
Well, the Academy, of course, makes, our report provides its recommendations. These have no binding requirements for the agency. They really peer review and suggestions and comments that we make in the spirit that we hope they will prove to be useful to the agency as it revises the document, or if it chooses to undertake revisions to the IRIS process itself.
So, I mean, they weren't initially given as, hey, you need to do this by the end of this year, or this is a big problem. That wasn't the intent, then, was it?
Well, an Academy committee would not make recommendations in that spirit. I mean, again, the Academy is advisory to the government.
Thank you. Mr. Trimble, you've reported this morning that the assessment, the IRIS assessment, was unresponsive. I think that's a word I heard a number of times. What do you believe is the underlying cause for that assessment, for your unresponsiveness assessment?
I believe the unresponsiveness I was referring to was in response to our 2008 report, where we made recommendations to improve the process. And then later in 2008, they made changes formalizing the process, which was essentially no change. They institutionalized the things we had identified as problematic. That process was then changed in 2009. So the lack of responsiveness is, to our prior recommendations, one of the reasons we put the area on our high-risk list.
I mean, you didn't answer my question. What do you think the underlying causes of that unresponsiveness?
Well, at that time, I believe the OMB and the EPA were committed to the procedures they had in place, and they were pleased with having OMB's involvement in controlling the process. And their position was that the OMB's comments and other agencies' comments were deliberative and should not be put in the public domain.
Okay, my time's expired, but you never really answered the question. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
I recognize Dr. Benishek for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished members of the panel, thank you for your time today. I know we're here to talk about chemicals, and as a physician, I have a bit of experience with chemicals. I'd like to talk today about a chemical called acrylonitrile, or AN. It kind of has a funny name, and we probably never heard of it, but we all come in contact with it. As a physician, I really haven't been aware that I was using the compound, but it's around in medicine a lot. It's found in everything from dialysis tubing to cell phones to computers and golf clubs. Recently, the EPA released a IRIS assessment for AN with a 60-day comment period. And based on an initial review of the draft, it doesn't seem to have a comprehensive, objective review of the science. The draft completely ignores many of the articles published in reputable peer-reviewed journals, notably many with opposing views. I'm concerned that the assessment will lead to burdensome regulations in a variety of industries, especially in my district. Plastics and boating industry, medical equipment. I find it troubling that the agency seems to spend a lot of time and money accusing us in Congress to ignoring science, but fails to follow some of its own advice. Is the EPA's objective to review all critical published scientific information when preparing this assessments, whether or not the agency agrees with the position? Dr. Anastas?
Thank you very much for the question. The short answer to your question is yes. We, as an essential part of all of our analyses, speaking generally across all of the IRIS assessments, is understanding the relevant, credible scientific information and composing its assessments. Those assessments, and speaking specifically to acrylonitrile right now, goes into an external peer review process where we get the reaction to this draft assessment. So if there are concerns about particular studies that may not have been identified, considered, that those are caught during this period in the peer review process.
Well, the reason I'm asking this is that apparently with this acrylonitrile review, there's no mention of several other publications. I'm looking at one here, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, part of the World Health Organization, published a review that wasn't cited. There was a review AAN on the North Carolina Scientific Advisory Board that wasn't cited. There's a review by an independent peer review panel organized by TARA, the Toxicology for Excellence in Risk Assessment. There's several conflicting, sources of information that aren't cited in the review, and I just want to understand how the committee decides which studies to include in the review and which studies not to include. I mean,
that's an excellent question. The process by which the studies are selected based on their relevance, their credibility, is something that, as we've spoken about, is always something that we're seeking to make clear, transparent with these public meetings, with this public external peer review. All of these comments are considered. That's why this draft is going out for this public peer review. I do want to clarify one thing that I mentioned earlier. These assessments are not regulations. These assessments are not risk assessments. These are the underlying scientific characterization of the hazard.
Well, it doesn't seem to me to, I've written papers where you may have like 100 citations and just not having all the citations that are available doesn't seem to make any sense to me. Why some are not listed, I just don't get it. Because you just put another citation in there. It makes sense to have comments on both sides of the issue.
Absolutely, and that's why we have these public sessions to consider all scientifically sound, credible information be part of these assessments.
And yet these things that I cited weren't included, so I just don't understand why not.
If there were any scientific, credible, independent studies that were not included, then this is the process to ensure that all of them are included. This is why we go to the external public peer review.
So then, are we going to include these studies that I mentioned to you in the future, or reevaluate the situation, or what?
Any literature, any study that is relevant, sound, independent, scientifically credible, anything that meets those criteria would certainly be included.
Well, great. Then we'll have the committee forward these studies to you, but maybe they can be included in your evaluation.
And the timing is excellent because this is the external peer review and public assessment comment.
All right. Thanks. I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now I recognize Mr. Miller for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This is an issue, the IRIS system, that this subcommittee considered when I was chair of the subcommittee. We have thousands of chemicals that are in widespread use. We really do not know what the public health consequences are of exposure to those chemicals. We have about 700 new chemicals entering the marketplace every year. We have no idea what most of those do to anybody. We've got cancer clusters and clusters of birth defects all over the country we know have got to be the result of exposure to something, and we don't know what. And the IRIS system is supposed to be how we assess the risk of exposure to chemicals. But despite all that, because of the system that was in place, there are only about 3 new or revised assessments being issued a year. And there was ample evidence of political interference and a great deal of influence by the industries that made those chemicals or use those chemicals. I have 3 charts I'd like to show. And I believe somebody is, yes, standing by. And I hope the witnesses can see these. This is actually a schematic of the process that the Bush administration inherited from the Clinton administration. Well, I believe it was in effect for most of the Bush administration. And then a step, or supposedly this was streamlined. Can we show the second? Yeah, that's the streamlined version. Now, at the time, I said that I was reminded of Chico Mark's quote, "Who you going to believe, me or your own eyes?" That was a streamlined version of the process that had existed before. What that did, however, was put OIRA in the middle of the whole process. Now, Dr. Anastas, when Dr. Brown scolded you for not getting your testimony in on time, you said you'd completed it, but you had to get it reviewed. Was that a review by OMB?
All testimony is reviewed by OMB.
Okay, and that's where the holdup was? Well, I know that you don't want to criticize OMB. Is OIRA part of OMB?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And that's the system that slowed it, that appeared to slow it down greatly. Now, Mr. Trimble, the GAO has been very involved in all this, in reviewing the IRIS system, and you're not suggesting. Well, let's now go to the third slide, and that's the slide that supposedly is streamlined, and actually it appears that you could believe your own eyes that is streamlined. You're not suggesting we go from that back to the previous system, are you?
No, sir. The opposite.
Okay, the opposite. All right, Dr. Samet, you reviewed a lot of several OIRA assessments. You looked at, let's see, formaldehyde, perchlorate, dioxin, trichloroethylene. I'm not one of the committee's doctors. And tetrachloroethylene. Which of those systems were those assessments done under?
I can't exactly answer that. I mean, I'd have to look at the timing of each of those and when they were done. They were mostly done over the last 5 or 6 years, so I guess that would be back with your 2004, 2008
Well,
slide.
Dr. Anastas, can you answer that question? Were any of these assessments that the academies have found fault with been performed under that system?
No.
They were all under the previous systems?
Correct.
The streamlined previous systems?
Correct.
All right. And again, although Susan Dudley, who headed OIRA at the time, sat right there, raised her right hand, took the same oath that you all had, and said that there was never they never really substituted their judgment on science for EPA. There was a huge amount of evidence that happened routinely. The impression from that period and from our hearings before is that the work EPA was doing to get a risk assessment through this streamlined process was one performed under fire, under hostile fire from the industries that produce the chemicals and from the industries and the agencies of government that use the chemicals. Is that correct?
Was that the characterization?
Yes, sir.
That was the characterization.
Okay, and is it possible that some of the fault that the academies have found with EPA's work in this is a result of the fact that the people performing the work felt they were under fire and were trying to anticipate every possible criticism?
There are those who have characterized that way, yes.
Okay. Would you be one of those who characterized it that way?
I think the excellent scientists who dedicate their professional lives to this have felt under a tremendous amount of pressure from different sources, correct.
Okay. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. It's nice seeing you stay within 5 minutes. No, I said that in all sincerity. Now, the chairman recognizes Mr. Rohrabacher for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I guess we've seen lots of examples where scientists are been put under pressure, especially during this investigation of global warming and such issues where scientists were denied grants because they did not believe in the global warming theory, which we heard reports of across the board for years in this committee. So we know that there are certain advocacy elements within the scientific community that are willing to pressure other people within the scientific community. It's sort of like tenure in college. For the college professors, of course, would never think about trying to control what type of people are hired on to their departments, but we all know that happens, don't we? I'd like to ask, in terms of how this affects the scientific questions that we're dealing with today, is and I certainly would. I will. I'll take you. I'll address it to you. You're the head man. Are the scientists who are involved with this risk assessment program? Are they? Are steps taken to make sure that they have not been part of advocacy groups prior to their involvement with this program?
I can say that I do not investigate the backgrounds of scientists.
Okay, so there's no background check to see if a scientist has been involved with an advocacy program or actually been hired perhaps by an advocacy organization prior to him getting involved and his decision-making being trusted by your organization.
The only background check that would be done is for the scientific excellence.
Okay, so you could have someone who is very ideological, very, very ideological, and even being hired by groups that have, are just adamant about what they believe, and that person could still be someone who you are relying on for their judgment not to be impaired.
I can only say that we hire people for their excellence in science, their demonstrated excellence in science.
Mm-hmm. And you don't take into consideration if that person had been involved in an organization that perhaps that organization is so committed to a position that it reflects anyone who could associate. There are certain groups that have a position, whether they're against what you believe or for what you believe, but they're so adamant in it that we know that might indicate the person doesn't have an open mind towards certain issues. But that's not taken into consideration for hiring someone?
You raise an excellent point, Congressman, because at the essence of scientific excellence is objectivity.
Correct.
And so when I use the words scientific excellence, embedded in that definition would be objectivity.
Okay. And however, someone's affiliation with advocacy, with certain advocacy groups, is not something that you would look at to determine their objectivity.
If a person skewed their science in order to meet ideological ends, that would be antithetical to scientific excellence.
And there's no organizations that you believe that just an association with that organization would say, well, maybe that person is just too much involved with advocating a position to be able to come on board.
I would only say that we need to evaluate the scientific excellence and the objectivity and other litmus tests or background checks.
What we've seen too much of is scientific excellence is dependent on whether someone agrees with me or not. And that's what we've seen over and over and over again by the liberal establishment here in this city in dealing with scientific issues. And I certainly would think that if we have certain people that are committed to a position and they are involved with organizations that are committed, that should be taken into consideration when giving them responsibility to assess whether or not something is scientifically viable or not. Let me ask you, going up another thing. The
Chairman's time is expired.
Oh, no. Pardon me?
Thank you, Mr. Robaca. I now recognize Mr. Clark for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is more than likely for Dr. Anastas, but anyone else could feel free to answer. It's really a basic one. I just wanted to get clarification again between the difference between an IRIS scientific assessment and a complete risk assessment, if there's certain elements in a risk assessment that the IRIS assessment does not address. And then ultimately, how you would compare the IRIS assessment in time development and in substance to the ultimate regulatory proposal that's issued?
Certainly, and thank you very much for the question. The information that is provided in an IRIS assessment is an essential and key part that feeds into a risk assessment. However, it is the hazard characterization. In order to come up with the risk assessment, the risk probability, you need exposure data. So the exposure of an individual to these substances through a variety of routes, whether it's children, it's breathing in air, it's ingested in the water. Those components coming together are part of the risk assessment process, which then feeds in to the risk management alternatives. Those are the regulatory determinations that are carried out by our program offices, our Office of Water, our Office of Air, to take into account a wide variety of other factors, including everything from socioeconomic, other considerations, technological feasibility of various risk management options. And so while the IRIS assessments and the information they provide is a critical piece, it is significantly removed from the end regulatory process.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Now recognize the full committee chairman, Mr. Hall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inasmuch as I don't know what questions have been asked or answers elicited, and as much as I probably wouldn't believe anything any of the three of them say, I'll yield back my time.
I can't believe it. Okay. Now, yeah, Mr. Sarbanes is still down there. You, Mr. Sarbanes, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you all for your testimony. I always start these hearings being ones that are about chemicals and the risks that chemicals pose out there, and our efforts to try to get a handle on that and get more information by observing that if the average member of the public understood how little information and knowledge we have about the chemicals that are being put out there in the stream of commerce, in the natural streams, and so forth, they'd be amazed and appalled. I think they have the expectation that our level of knowledge is much, much higher than it is. And a lot of the delay that we see in the kind of regulation and oversight and assessment is something they wouldn't imagine would be happening in the United States of America in the 21st century. So I don't know who's watching this hearing out there in the public, but I hope they spread the word on this. I was looking at this silver book, as it's so called, and on the back it talks about how risk assessment has become a dominant public policy tool for making choices based on limited resources to protect public health and the environment. So we've talked a lot about that. However, risk assessment is at a crossroads, it says. Despite advances in the field, risk assessment faces a number of significant challenges, including lengthy delays in completing complex risk assessments, lack of data leading to significant uncertainty in risk assessments, and many chemicals in the marketplace that have not been evaluated, and emerging agents requiring assessment, which is a pretty good encapsulation of the testimony and the exchange that we've been having here this morning. I think you all recognize that. And I see the three of you working in concert to try to improve the process, improve the reliability of the risk assessment process. And Dr. Anastas, I appreciate your lack of defensiveness with respect to the assessments and evaluations that have been done that you invite in terms of the IRIS process, and you're getting some good constructive input. Then commenting on the Silver Book, the back flap here says, Science and Decisions, which is the name of the Silver Book, makes practical scientific and technical recommendations to address these challenges, i.e. the ones just referred to. Can you speak to the value of this? And this is a follow-up on an earlier framework known as the Red Book, as I understand it, and it complements it. But can you speak to the value of this? And then, Dr. Salmon, I'd like to get your perspective on it as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for the question, because the so-called Silver Book was carried out by the National Research Council and chaired by a very well-respected professor at Johns Hopkins University named Tom Burke, and provided some excellent frameworks for how we need to continuously improve our risk assessment processes, how we need to think more broadly if we're going to ensure that the risk framework is as strong as it needs to be. As science advisor of the agency, I have the honor of chairing the Science, Technology, and Policy Council. Adopting the recommendations in the Science Book is something that is going on in real time, moving ahead so that across the agency, the findings of the Silver Book are able to be incorporated.
Thank you. Dr. Salmon.
I think the Silver Book was an important updating and broadening of the concepts that were in the so-called Red Book. I would also bring your attention to one other report that came out from the National Research Council around the same time, Toxicity Testing for the 21st Century, which laid out, I'm sorry to use the word again, but a roadmap or a blueprint for how to address the problem highlighted in the comments on the back of the Silver Book, the need to have a way to test with validity the many chemicals coming into the marketplace. And the proposal in that document is how do we use our new science to try and address this question with some certainty, dealing with the hundreds of chemicals whose risks we're uncertain about as they come into the marketplace, using the best science possible. So I think that together those two reports do set out hopefully a new approach for the future.
Thank you. May I yield back?
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you so much, Mr. Sarbanes. I want to thank the panel for y'all's testimony and your answering questions, particularly in an expeditious manner, and I want to thank committee members for also asking their questions in an expeditious manner. You will be excused. Members may desire to submit written questions, and I trust that we'll get replies in a timely manner from y'all, so y'all are excused, and thank you for your testimony today. And if the second panel will expeditiously also take their seats. Okay. Good. I like that. Mm-hmm. I'm going to try to keep time pretty quick. Because,
on when people's amendments. Apparently there was like 8 amendments that didn't get offered last night because of misleading information when their amendment was given. We're recommending right after 1 minute we should get to the floor too, because you have 3 amendments left. So we're recommending you spend the afternoon on the floor. Okay. You can step out for your interview and other stuff. Okay. That's where we're gonna need you next. I want to try and get this now moving quick.
Yeah.
Turn your mic off. Turn your mic off.
All right, if we can get started right away, I appreciate everybody getting settled in very quickly. This time I'd like to welcome and introduce our final panel of witnesses. First is the Honorable Calvin Dooley, is President and CEO of the American Chemistry Council. Congressman Dooley previously represented the 20th Congressional District in California. We have Ms. Marina Steinzer is professor at the University of Maryland School of Law and founder and president of the Center for Progressive Reform. We have Dr. Gail Charnley is principal at Health Risk Strategies. Dr. Charnley is an internationally recognized scientist who has served on several advisory committees, including peer review panels for the EPA and FDA, the Presidential Congressional Commission on Risk Assessment and Risk Management, and is currently on the National Academy of Sciences Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology. Then the Honorable Chris Bowage is mayor for the city of Elizabeth, New Jersey, a position he has held for the past 18 years. I'm sorry. You've got one of the hardest jobs in politics. Mayor Bowage also serves as chair of the Conference of Mayors Brownfields Task Force. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, and please try to maintain that 5 minutes. After which, members of the committee will have 5 minutes to ask each questions. I ask committee members to please be mindful of the time. Y'all's written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. It is the practice of the subcommittee on investigations and oversight to receive testimony under oath. Do any of you have objections to taking an oath? Mayor? Okay. Let the record reflect that all witnesses are willing to take an oath. You also may be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel here today? Let the record reflect that none of the witnesses have counsel. I think, Congressman Dooley, you indicated you do not. Okay, that's correct. If all of you would please now stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to affirm or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that all the witnesses participating have taken the oath. I now recognize our first witness, Congressman Dooley, for 5 minutes.
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to speak to the pressing need to fix the Environmental Protection Agency's Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS. IRIS is one of the most important programs that EPA uses to assess the safety of chemicals. But in recent years, IRIS frequently has been criticized for failing to meet the high standards of scientific inquiry, transparency, and quality. I've outlined several examples of flawed IRIS assessments in my written testimony, but the recent review of formaldehyde is perhaps the most telling. After EPA's draft IRIS review of formaldehyde was scrutinized, EPA asked the independent experts at the National Academy of Sciences, NAS, to review its findings. The NAS review questioned the evidence IRIS used to support its conclusions that a link exists between the exposure to formaldehyde and certain types of leukemia, stating, conclusions appear to be based on a subjective view of the overall data, and the absence of a causal framework for these cancers is particularly problematic given the inconsistencies in the epidemiological data, the weak animal data, and the lack of mechanistic data. The NAS report also devoted an entire chapter to needed program improvements. NAS summed it up by saying, the committee is concerned about the persistence of problems encountered with IRIS assessments over the year, especially given the multiple groups that have highlighted them. If the methodological issues are not addressed, further assessments may still have the same general and avoidable problems that they highlighted in their report. While IRIS is a complex program that examines complex issues, the problems can be boiled down to two things. First, IRIS does not reflect modern scientific methods or 21st century knowledge about how chemicals interact in the body at different levels of exposure. Rather, IRIS continues to rely too heavily on outdated assumptions that were formulated in the 1970s. Second, there is little independence in the program's peer review process. EPA controls each step of the review process and ultimately decides which recommendations from peer review groups to act upon and which to ignore. IRIS needs a comprehensive overall to ensure that assessments are based on proven scientific data and modern scientific understanding. The peer review process must be enhanced so there is an honest broker to ensure that IRIS assessments are reviewed independently and recommendations from peer reviews and public comments are adequately incorporated. While EPA announced some process changes earlier this week, and we are pleased that EPA has done so and that they recognize the program must be reformed, we remain concerned about the lack of a truly independent peer review process. ACC continues to believe that NAS should review all pending IRIS assessments to ensure their quality until the systematic problems with the program are fixed. And I will stress that, until we have the confidence that the systemic problems are fixed. If the improvements announced this week are effective, that will be validated by NAS reviews. Anyone who looks at the evidence, whether you're a state regulator, a public health official, or a furniture maker, can see that the IRIS program is broken. Getting it right is in the interest of us all. The current deficiencies and the lack of confidence in the program cause delays and unnecessary costs. Flawed assessments create public confusion, unwarranted alarm, unnecessary product deselection, and litigation, all of which can put jobs and innovation at risk without a sound scientific basis. By making needed changes to IRIS, we can minimize delays and provide answers to the public, public health professionals, and industry in a far more credible and timely way. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Congressman. I now recognize our next witness, Ms. Steinzor. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate the opportunity to testify on one of EPA's most important and foundational programs. These days, the more important a public health program, the more likely it is to be the subject of relentless, intemperate, and unjustified attacks. IRIS is no exception. The program is a serious, well-informed, and carefully conducted scientific effort to synthesize existing research in order to set reference doses for the worst toxic chemicals. But industry lobbyists have mischaracterized it as an anti-scientific effort to demonize such ostensibly benign substances as arsenic, formaldehyde, and dioxin. Arsenic, formaldehyde, dioxin. Really? Without IRIS, EPA would be hard-pressed to develop standards for the control of emissions of toxic chemicals that cause brain damage, cardiovascular illness, reproductive dysfunction, cancer, and a range of other diseases. Delaying IRIS profiles has and will endanger public health, an intolerable outcome that this committee must not allow to happen. The simple fact is that everyone attending this hearing would be hard-pressed to come up with more than a handful of toxic chemicals that were exonerated by additional research. The overwhelmingly powerful historic trend moves in the opposite direction. As the research accumulates, chemicals prove to be more toxic than we first imagined, often by several orders of magnitude. From the American public's perspective, the central and urgent problem with IRIS is not that it rushes to judgment on toxic chemicals. Far from it. The problem is that repeated rounds of redundant peer review and interagency comment allow, in fact invite, chemical manufacturers to slow the program to a crawl. Because of these delays, IRIS is woefully incomplete. Profiles are missing for at least 255 high-priority chemicals. A 2008 GAO report warned that the Bush administration's approach to IRIS left the database at risk of becoming obsolete. To its credit, the Obama administration revised IRIS in an effort to speed the production of assessments. Although these changes are a definite improvement, the rate of production is still slow enough that EPA will not catch up with its existing backlog for another 55 years. Chemical manufacturers and their allies, most notably federal agencies like the Department of Defense and NASA, have targeted IRIS as a choke point for regulation. Anyone who has followed the IRIS program closely for many years cannot help but find their recent denunciations of the program disingenuous and surreal. They have been in the thick of the action since IRIS began, making their case to IRIS staff, more senior EPA officials, sympathetic federal agencies and departments, and the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. In fact, the reason why IRIS profiles have ballooned into unmanageable length is the reaction of EPA staff to constant harassment by industry participants. The remedies proposed by the chemical industry will make these problems worse, not better. One of the most intemperate proposals is that OIRA increase its oversight of the program. OIRA is staffed almost exclusively by economists who have no better idea of what constitutes a good RFD than any other layperson. A second demand is that the NRC be brought in to review all IRIS assessments. The academic scientists who serve on NRC review committees receive compensation that does not nearly pay for their time. Instead, they are motivated by a commitment to public service and the prestige of serving on a panel to consider cutting-edge scientific issues. Using NRC to run around double-checking routine government work would disrupt this delicate balance, damaging the national academies as well as EPA. The final example of overreaction is the rider proposed for EPA's appropriations bill that would bar EPA from moving forward with future assessments until all existing assessments have been revised to conform to the NRC's advice about the formaldehyde assessment. This proposal would paralyze the IRIS program for the foreseeable future by forcing its staff to engage in a massive round of paper shuffling. The chemicals we are talking about here are the worst of the worst, produced in amounts of millions of pounds annually. The victims of further IRIS delays are neither the companies that make these chemicals nor the scientists engaged in the endless research, but rather Americans and their health. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Steinzer. I now recognize our next witness, Dr. Charnley, for 5 minutes. Dr. Charnley.
Thank you and good morning. I am a toxicologist, a human health risk analyst, and a toxicology consultant who has relied for many years on the information contained in the IRIS database for my work. I'm speaking on the basis of my 30-year career as a scientist evaluating the relationship between chemical exposures and human health effects, and I am not representing any organization today. The role and purpose of IRIS are good and well-intentioned, but over the years, IRIS has lost its way, straying from science and veering towards advocacy. As a result, it no longer has much scientific credibility outside the agency or, importantly, within the agency itself. IRIS started out as a good idea, an advisory group of scientists that assess chemical toxicity for the rest of EPA. The reach of IRIS goes way beyond EPA, however, as other federal agencies, state and local governments, both within the United States and in other countries, lacking their own resources to generate toxicity values, chemical toxicity values, have come to rely on those generated by IRIS. Because the influence of IRIS is so broad, the scientific quality and integrity of its reviews are critically important. The problem is that IRIS toxicity evaluations do not follow a rigorous, objective, transparent, scientific weight of evidence process. instead relying on what, in the absence of such a process, appears to be cherry-picking data in support of policy preferences as needed. A true weight of evidence analysis should explicitly present the criteria for inclusion and exclusion of studies so that all relevant information is included and so that biases towards the inclusion of certain outcomes are avoided. IRIS assessments fail to use a weight of evidence process despite the explicit direction to do so provided by EPA's own risk assessment guidance and repeatedly by various National Academy of Sciences committees. My written statement details some of the large body of EPA documentation stating that it is EPA policy to perform balanced weight of evidence analysis as part of chemical risk assessment, a policy that is clearly being ignored by IRIS. I think the solution is not to try once more to tweak or revamp the existing process, but to start over. Public health is not served by a broken, cumbersome, controversial process that lacks rigorous scientific foundation and a transparent, replicable weight of evidence framework. Setting up a more effective process should follow the recommendations of a National Academy of Sciences committee convened for that purpose and should follow a weight of evidence procedure recommended by the Academy. Chapter 7 of the Academy's formaldehyde report provides helpful but general guidance toward that end. And no, I am not advocating that NAS review all IRIS reviews. EPA's recently proposed IRIS redesign relies on EPA's Science Advisory Board for quote-unquote independent review and oversight instead of the Academy. However, the SAB is not independent. EPA officials select SAB members, formulate charge questions, provide staff support for the review process, and oversee SAB deliberations and report drafting. In contrast, the NAS process for selecting scientific panel members and conducting reviews assures independence and objectivity along with appropriate expertise, for which they are not compensated in any way. Truly independent peer review is the only way to give stakeholders confidence in the credibility of the outcome. Stakeholders are likely to accept the outcome of an independent Academy committee and unlikely to accept the outcome of an EPA-administered committee. In conclusion, the IRIS process is dysfunctional, and attempts to tweak it have not resulted in meaningful improvements. Changes proposed this week are promising, but I believe that implementing those changes and implementing an improved, scientifically based, transparent IRIS process would benefit greatly from National Academy of Sciences guidance. The NAS is in a unique position to provide unbiased, credible, expert advice that sadly is so critically needed at this point if we are to move IRIS into a 21st century approach to assessing chemical toxicity effectively. Thank you.
Exactly 5 minutes.
Look at that.
Exactly. Mayor Bowledge, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I just want to say up front that I'm a mayor. I'm not a scientist, so I talk about trying to create jobs, economic development. We work with our city councils, our department managers. We make decisions on the ground every day. But risk management is one of those areas where local elected officials must make decisions, and we always like to have the best available tools. The IRIS system is a mix of scientific measurement, expert guesswork, and surrounded by a high level of uncertainty with what might happen to humans if they are exposed to chemical substances. In the end, from my position, it's a tool. And we've learned through the experience of governing city that when you use a tool to guide decision making, you want to use the right tool applied to the right problem and use the tool in the right way. And the IRIS method has to yield a result that makes common sense. I've worked closely with the Conference of Mayors for 15 years in convincing the EPA and the Congress that not all contaminated sites in communities are the same. There are grossly contaminated sites called Superfund, but there are hundreds of thousands throughout our country less contaminated brownfield sites. I'm very concerned with the public health in my community, and if that health threat can be dealt with and properly redeveloped, then it's a win-win for the community. Brownfield legislation has helped us remove that public health threat. We put these lands back to productive use, creating jobs, urban development, new sources of revenues that are used to support public safety, public health, and maintain our physical infrastructure. One of the greatest impediments to this type of progress was the way that the EPA and the press have overcharacterized the risk to the public. This attached an unpardonable stigma to any site, whether the contamination was serious or negligible. Generally, the risk has been overplayed, and it's become difficult from my position to educate the public about the difference between a brownfield site and a Superfund site. This was the case even after the EPA Administrator Browner released over 30,000 sites that were on the CERCLAS list, and these were not contaminated enough to warrant any further EPA action. I have a Superfund site in the city of Elizabeth. It's severely contaminated and way too costly to ever clean up. I also have brownfield sites. I'm proud to report we developed many of those. IKEA Supercenter, Jersey Gardens on a 166-acre former landfill. Has 4 hotels as well as 2 million square feet of retail space. They're thriving. They've created hundreds of jobs, promoted redevelopment, and has been an enormous success for our community. I've submitted to the committee a report prepared by the Conference of Mayors that shows brownfield redevelopment in cities across the nation have had the same positive impact because of local government's decisions. EPA's dioxin reassessment will converge with the IRIS system, and this combination will impact a wide range of policy decisions. The Conference of Mayors believes this tool, as applied to brownfield sites, could bring back the stigma of a Superfund site. And as a tool, the IRIS system relies on toxicity values that are established with a very wide margin of error that is intended to allow for uncertainty. So when the IRS system is used to inform risk management decisions, it must be noted that the compound effect of overly conservative toxicity values with overly conservative exposure scenarios can yield a very distorted characterization of risk. For example, when EPA proposed to lower the dioxin soil concentration for a contaminated site remediation, they proposed to lower the existing guideline from 1.1 part per billion to 76 parts per trillion, or even 3.7 parts per trillion. So not only is the exposure scenario unrealistic, but at 3.7 parts per trillion of dioxin, the soil in every urban center in this country would pose an unacceptable risk because background levels are normally 2 to 4 times higher than that. So here's what troubles the mayors. People get 95% of their dioxin from the foods they eat, not from a contaminated brownfield site. EPA continues to rely on a worst-case exposure scenario. So I have doubts about how this IRIS tool can be applied with any certainty. So I'd like to make some following suggestions: that the EPA can continue to improve the IRIS and the information base on toxicity and exposure assessment. The exposure assessment assumptions should be evaluated by the National Academies of Science to determine if more realistic assumptions are appropriate. For example, it would be helpful to have actual measurements of a most likely case scenario in addition to a worst case scenario. IRIS should be a tool to advise decisions, not mandate them. Mayors need the best tools available to help us make sound decisions. Our goals for our cities are to protect the public health and the environment while encouraging economic vitality. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this time, and thank members of the committee as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I thank y'all all for your testimony today. Reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will, at this point, open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Charnley, to your knowledge, does the IRIS program reflect the framework outlined in the report, Risk Assessment and Risk Management in Regulatory Decision-Making, developed by the Presidential Congressional Commission on Risk Assessment and Risk Management? Can you briefly outline the key aspects of the framework that should be reflected in IRIS risk assessments, and what does it mean to understand the context of a risk problem as discussed in the framework? Dr. Charnley.
Well, what the Risk Commission framework does is emphasizes the importance of figuring out what the problem is you're trying to address before you address it, to clarify what your risk management goals are, and use those as a guide to risk assessment. As Dr. Anastas pointed out, however, the IRIS program does not perform risk assessments. It generates safety values. It generates toxicity values that then a risk assessment would use and compare to exposure values to come up with some understanding of what a human health risk might actually be. So what the IRIS program does is provide some of the information that could be used in risk management, but doesn't it doesn't have the same context.
Okay, Congressman Dooley, 2 days ago, Dr. Anastas participated in a press conference and offered some insight on a new and improved IRIS process that will allegedly incorporate the Academy's recommendations from April while building upon the 2009 revisions pro-offered by Administrator Jackson. Can you comment on the agency's announcement? Congressman, press the button so we can hear you, please, sir.
Yeah, we commend EPA and Dr. Anastas on some of their recent actions. But I think whatever stakeholder you might be here, whether you're a member of Congress, a mayor, whether you're representing consumer interest groups or environmental groups, or if you're part of the industry, we want to have an IRIS process that meets a gold standard. We heard Dr. Samet said today that he would barely give it a passing grade on the formaldehyde IRIS assessment. I don't think any of us think that that's adequate. And so what we have been suggesting is that we are looking forward to the reforms that EPA is enacting now to improve their program. But I think we would all have a greater confidence that they were getting it right if for the next period of time that the next IRIS assessments that are coming out that are under these new reforms, that we would submit them to NAS just to make sure that we would have a double check on it to understand, did they enact the best processes to ensure that we're using the best scientific process, that we had, using the standards to ensure that the weight of evidence on the scientific research was out there was adequate, that we had a peer review process that provided the appropriate level of transparency and independence. That's what we are suggesting when the industry, as we were characterized, is asking for NAS to play a major role in reviewing the IRIS assessments that could be issued in the next few months under the new and improved guidelines. We would all benefit and have greater confidence if we had NAS, taking a review, making sure they got it right.
Thank you, Congressman. Mayor Bowledge. I've got 1 minute left, so please answer quickly. Can you give us an idea of what sort of actions that you would need to consider as mayor if EPA proceeds with its proposed dioxin PRG, which, as you note, is at or below background levels, and what would it mean to your city, your constituents, your economy, your jobs, et cetera? What would be the positive outcomes of such a low dioxin PRG? That is, how would it affect safety?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I can only explain it real quickly we had an outdated plastics facility and we wanted to convert it to Little League fields. We scraped away 3 inches of dirt and remediated that and converted it into 2 healthy Little League fields. If the levels are lowered, we're going to wind up scraping away, 8 inches, 10 inches, 12 inches, a lot more of the dirt in order to make that area safe for Little League. You make the cost of a municipality increase substantially. And I don't know of any kids who are rolling around in the brownfields who have caught dioxin.
And my time's expired now. I recognize Ms. Edwards for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. I just want to start out by noting that I do share Mr. Warbacker's view that it's important for us to know who's before us and who's influencing a process, but merely working in an industry or working at an organization that advocates for a certain position is not a reason to exclude either that testimony or information. Nonetheless, I think it's also important that we have the same kind of transparency and accountability that we're demanding of the EPA and other agencies in their process is the same kind of transparency and accountability that we want in those who seek to influence or advocate in the process because it could otherwise operate to the detriment of the public health. Dr. Charmley, I've looked at your resume. It's very impressive. And I note that you're currently serving on the National Academy of Sciences Board of Environmental Science and Toxicology. Your appointment began in 2009. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And when you joined I also note in your testimony you indicated that you've participated on numerous peer review panels convened by the EPA. You'd say that in your participation you acted independently. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. And when you joined the National Academy of Science Board on Environmental Science and Toxicology, we've been told that you would occasionally, maybe once or some number of times, recuse yourself from board discussions of formaldehyde. Is that right?
That's correct.
And why did you feel a need to, or were you required to recuse yourself? And in addition, who was paying you at the time, and what were you being paid to do that required your recusal?
Nobody was paying me at the time, but before I joined the board, I had given some advice to the Formaldehyde Council on how the National Academy of Sciences process works. And so when I served on the board, although the Academy does not believe that previous employment counts as a conflict, I felt that from an optics point of view, from a perception point of view, that it would make sense to recuse myself from any discussions of formaldehyde, just so that...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's not talk about optics. Let me just ask, were you specifically in your, prior to your appointment, were you paid to advise the Formaldehyde Council about ways in which they could use the NAS process to thwart the assessment process through IRIS?
Of course not.
And so I'm just curious, were you paid by them to advise you on how to get an academy study on the EPA's IRIS draft assessment for formaldehyde?
I was not.
Okay, so what we will do is perhaps ask you some questions, specific questions on the record, and also the Academy about the recusal process and about your work for the Formaldehyde Council and whether that had any impact on its work. Mr. Dooley, when we go to the Formaldehyde Council's webpage right now, and I have it, we're directed to a page that has the ACC logo on it. And then both organizations are shown to reside at the same address in Arlington, Virginia. What do you say about that?
The Formaldehyde Council, just earlier this year, I guess about 6 months ago, moved from being an independent agency to become one of among 50 different specific product panels that we have under ACC. So they are a self-funded group that is operated under the umbrella of the American Chemistry Council.
So maybe I'm confused, but so what we have here today is we have an organization that's taken on the work of the Formaldehyde Council, an expert who advised the Formaldehyde Council, in my view, I think, to just use its power to get the NAS study started. And then we're also aware, I know I am, that Dr. Anastas's appointment was held up in the Senate by Senator Vitter until EPA would agree to fund the NAS formaldehyde review. And then we have one of the people who was advising the Formaldehyde Council on how to get a report requested of the Academy, I believe. And that report's now being misused to excuse or cripple EPA's assessment process. And so, as far as I'm aware, none of that or those relationships have been disclosed to the committee, but it certainly puts your testimony in an informative light. Thank you very much, and I yield.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. The chairman now recognizes Dr. Benachek for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find this all kind of scary because, we have limited resources to deal with these risks. When you hear conflicting testimony as to the accuracy and broadness of the investigation concerning a chemical risk, you want to spend your resources toward the chemical that has the most risk. and not have that risk be politicized. So you're wasting your resources on something that is not where you should be spending your resources. Dr. Charnley, do you have these same concerns that I do? I mean, about this process? I mean, I'm concerned about this, the Scientific Advisory Board for the EPA, being, open and not being biased. I find in different areas of the EPA, the scientific advisory boards don't have the experts on the panel that they should have, that have enough knowledge of the thing that they're actually judging the scientific validity of. The people there are not the experts in the field. Do you have any information about that you can relate to us here?
Well, I think that's probably correct. I think that the difference with the academy process is that a committee is convened of scientists to specifically address the substance or subject under consideration, so that their expertise does directly inform whatever the subject matter is. And I do agree with you that putting resources towards substances that do not pose big public health impacts directs us away from issues and substances that do. And I don't think that's appropriate.
I so much agree with you. Mr. Dooley, let me ask you a question. Do you think that the people in the formaldehyde business want trouble with formaldehyde?
No, absolutely not. I mean, but this again comes to the essence of what I think this hearing is all about. Is that how do we establish an IRIS assessment process that has the confidence of whether it's the NGO community or whether it's industry, that we are ensuring that it's using the best science and the best scientific process, and that's when the NAS reviewed formaldehyde. The IRIS review of formaldehyde, they found it was, significantly flawed. That doesn't serve anyone's purpose, and, formaldehyde is a building block chemical. But, one of the things even on this IRIS assessment, it has consequences. And so what EPA was proposing there was an assessment level for formaldehyde in terms of where it could, be concern of cancer, that they set a reference dose level that was 0.008 parts per billion. That was the level that they said we should be, consumers or a risk of exposure should be concerned about. The World Health Organization had also done an assessment and concluded that the average person's breath that you exhale is up to 8 parts per billion. So, you back up and you say, is this IRIS risk assessment providing information that is really informing public health, concerns? When, by their own action level or reference dose, it is 1,000 times greater than the formaldehyde in the air that we exhale. And that's where we think that, we got to step back and understand is that how are we going to establish an IRIS process as assessing or considering hazard and exposure to some degree that actually can provide information that allows the mayor to make the responsible decision, allows state regulators also to impose actions, as well as informs other federal regulatory actions that emanate from this IRIS risk assessment. It needs to be done right. And what we're suggesting is until we have the confidence it's right, we ought to allow NAS to review the IRIS assessments, and hopefully the reforms that Dr. Anastas spoke about this week will give us the positive outcome.
Appreciate it. I yield back my time. Thank you.
I recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are similar to Ms. Edwards. Dr. Charnley, you testified that you were not testifying on behalf of anyone. Your disclosure statement says simply that you're not testifying on behalf of anyone. I assume that means nobody is paying you for sitting here today. I haven't asked you a question yet. But our research that our staff did shows that you have in the past worked for the Tobacco Institute, Philip Morris, Covington & Burling, a law firm that presumably was representing industry, Chlorine Chemical Council, which is part of the American Chemistry Council, American Chemistry Council, CropLife America, which is a pesticide manufacturer, Food Industry Dioxin Working Group, coal companies, and then a long list of groups that are funded by those industry groups. You have written papers or testified about perchlorate, dioxin, mercury. You've produced papers and editorial correspondence to learned journals challenging the idea that children should get any extra measure of protection in regulatory science. You spoke of optics. Do you think the optics here would not have required that you tell this committee some of your the work that you have done for industry?
Well, I think I stated clearly that I'm a toxicology consultant. In my written testimony, I state that I work for, I consult to private entities, and it's you know, you found who I work for, so I mean, it's not like that I'm not disclosing that. I'd be happy to. I have a list here of a lot of the organizations that I've worked for.
Could you provide that to the
Absolutely.
And could you also provide the issues that you have worked for on them?
Sure.
Work on them for them.
I'd be happy to.
Okay, that would.
Most of the work I do is pro bono, by the way.
Pro bono?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we actually our able committee staff also found an invoice that you had done a couple of years ago that showed your billing rate was $325 an hour. So you do also do some work for pay.
I do. I do both.
Okay. You spoke earlier of recusing yourself from a peer review panel when formaldehyde came up, which is admirable. I applaud that. If you've got an apparent conflict, then you should recuse yourself. But was that before or after you wrote a letter to what's the name of the health, environmental health perspectives that did not disclose that the research that you referred to in the letter was funded by the chlorine industry?
I have never failed to disclose the source of my funding in anything I've published.
Okay. Did you write a letter to the environmental health perspectives?
Yes.
Did it have to do with chlorine?
I don't remember which one you're referring to. I'm sorry.
Okay. You don't recall a controversy in which environmental health perspectives, I assume, is a learned journal, a peer-reviewed learned journal?
It is a peer-reviewed journal, yes.
Okay. You don't recall that they changed their disclosure requirements as a result of a controversy about a letter that you wrote?
No. I recall that I said to the editor that I did not believe that I had a conflict because I no longer worked for the organization that had funded this similar work earlier, and according to the National Academy of Sciences definition of conflict, which would apply to current employment, I did not have a conflict. However, I voluntarily disclosed that I had worked for such an entity in the past.
Okay. So it sounds like this whole issue is coming back to you now.
No, well, go ahead.
All right, no, that's all right. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions, but this remains a frustration in witnesses before this committee who simply fill out this, and I had a discussion in the committee when our rules were adopted that substantially limited the disclosure requirements, in which I was assured that if a witness had substantial economic interest, those would be disclosed. And we have seen repeatedly witnesses appear before this committee and appear and testify simply as public-spirited, disinterested citizens, and it appears their entire livelihood has come from the industry whose interests are at stake in the committee hearing. I would certainly hope that we could do better in the future.
Thank you. I'll take that up with the full committee chairman. Thanks for your comments. I'll now recognize myself for some questions and assure the panel that I won't spend my entire time trying to defame all of your character. First, I want to make a few brief comments about what I'm hearing today. As a new member of Congress, I think the American people, if they were hearing this hearing today about EPA and about the assessments they're making on chemicals, the American people would feel they're not getting a good bang for their buck. Let's remind everyone of the budget of the EPA in 2008 was $7.6 billion. The budget was $10.3 billion in 2010. And believe it or not, the EPA received $7.2 billion in stimulus money, and yet we're at a hearing today discussing the fact that we have the inability to properly assess chemicals at the EPA. And that's not my opinion. Let me read from the GAO testified before the subcommittee that in 2009 that EPA has not been able to complete timely, credible chemical assessments or decrease its backlog of 70 as of 2008 ongoing assessments, even though they received around $7.2 billion in stimulus money. And it says further, because the EPA staff time was dedicated to completing assessments in the backlog, EPA's ability to both keep the more than 540 existing assessments up to date and initiate new assessments was limited. So I think, from my perspective, this calls into question a lot of the rules that the EPA is currently putting out across the economic spectrum that's hurting our economy. And it's becoming pretty clear to me we don't have solid scientific evidence to back that up. So what I want to do is direct my questions first to Congressman Dooley about a couple of areas. Do you see that the assessment ability of the IRIS as being adequate? And I think you've stated before that you don't think it is. And based on that, do you see that there are long-standing economic impacts of their decision-making process based on this information that is hurting our job creation in our country?
First off is that I think, where the American Chemistry Council is now is that we're very supportive of the suggestions that the NAS made to EPA for reforms. We're encouraged that EPA has indicated that they're going to try to enact some of those reforms. It is not mutually exclusive to have an IRIS risk assessment that's being operated in a manner that is consistent with what NAS has recommended and be a more efficient and result in quicker IRIS assessments being done. And there shouldn't be any disagreement among any of us on that issue. But the problem we have now is that when I was in Congress, I represented a district in the Central Valley of California. It was the 5th lowest per capita GDP district in the nation out of 435. And the actions that IRIS could take that establish reference doses that are below those that pose any public health safety impact at expected levels of exposure, whether it's formaldehyde or dioxin or whether it's arsenic, and that goes below what are background levels existing in naturally, is that has not only public health impacts, but it has public welfare impacts. If you require a lot of the low-income communities in my old district to comply with what is now a new arsenic standard that goes below what is naturally occurring, is that they have to allocate resources to water treatment systems that aren't available for public health or education or other public benefits, just as the mayor said with dioxin. It also has an impact on private sector investments, is that if we have to divert revenues to achieve a higher level of remediation or changing processes that go to achieve an IRIS assessment that is below background levels, is that you are taking capital that could otherwise be invested in new manufacturing capacity, creating jobs, that is going for a use that has very little benefit and very little public health benefit.
I think the answer is yes, it's having a significant impact. And at this time, I'll yield the rest of my time and recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In addition to IRIS, which is located in EPA, there are other programs that conduct assessments of chemical risks that are located in other agencies and departments. And this question is to anyone here. To what degree have these assessments provided conflicting guidance or conclusions? And to what degree have these different programs provided, really been duplicating work? And if you found any conflicts or duplication, what proposals do you have to better coordinate and reduce the likelihood of conflicts and reduce the cost of duplication?
If I could respond to that. IRIS is the premier international source of reference dose information, which is the level below which exposure is acceptable and above which exposure is not acceptable. So it really measures whether, if we fed you dioxin on a spoon, what the level would be that would cause problems. As has been said repeatedly here, it is not a risk assessment process. It doesn't make a determination. IRIS itself is a scientific database that doesn't make a determination about what to do about the risk. It simply talks about what the reference dose is. It receives 2,000 visits a day on the internet from all over the world. That's a pretty high number for a database that is this technical. And if anything, it needs to be bigger, better, and stronger, not abolished, not paralyzed, because without it, people would really not know what a toxicological profile, what the reference dose was for chemicals. So it really is unique, and it provides a tremendous service, I would say.
Maybe, as Ms. Steinzer mentioned, is that the IRIS reference dose give a standard which is not acceptable. And so I go back and I'll use the formaldehyde example, where the World Health Organization said the breath that you exhale has 8 parts per billion. IRIS set a reference dose of 0.0008 parts per billion. You can also use the example of arsenic, where you have a little bit of a difference in standards internally, where you had IRIS made a risk example, a risk assessment level of 1.4 parts per billion. But then you also have, on the safe drinking water, a standard of 10 parts per billion for drinking water. So there is some inconsistencies among various organizations there. So I think that's where, and there was a characterization, we made a suggestion from ACC that there ought to be a role for OMB to play in this whole reevaluation of the risk assessment. And what we're driving at here is because you got multiple agencies. You got FDA that's involved with some chemicals, whether it's food contact notification or CIFSAN. You have the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry. You have the National Toxicology Program that does the report on carcinogens. You have EPA and IRIS. Is that there needs to be a quarterback, that someone that's not making determinations and evaluating necessarily the risk assessments, but that there is a common scientific process being utilized that is ensuring that we're incorporating the best laboratory practices, that we're using the best weight of evidence practices to reach conclusions. And that ought to be consistent across all these multiple agencies. And that's where we suggested that there is an appropriate role for OMB to play to ensure that you have that consistency so that you don't have disparity in conclusions and action levels across various organizations that are maybe addressing the same chemical.
Can I just add one point? My son, who's 20, is sitting behind me, and one of the most distressing things I've heard today is that he has formaldehyde in his body and exhales it at levels that are much higher than the reference dose set by the EPA database. That didn't happen because he's walking through a natural paradise in the Chesapeake Bay, although I wish that were true. It's because the air is polluted. We live in a non-attainment area that is awash in toxics and all sorts of other problems, and that's why that's happened. I also want to just say for the record, there are 2 scientists, 2, who work at OIRA. So making them the quarterback of anything would be a strange football game indeed.
The gentleman.
If I can just respond to the formaldehyde.
The gentleman's time is expired. We'll try to get back to you. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the panel. Congressman Dooley, I wanted to, you said a lot of nice things about the National Academy of Sciences, and I guess that's the basis for your proposal that they come in and review the risk assessments that IRIS is performing for some period of time. And you've also responded positively to changes that the EPA has said they're going to make in response to the National Academy of Science recommendations and so forth. On that basis, I assume you have pretty good feelings about this Silver Book, because that is a product of the National Academy of Science on the very topic that we're discussing here today. So I wanted to get your reactions to whether this is a constructive resource.
We think it is a very constructive resource. It's not that we agree with every element in it, but we think that it really does set a roadmap that has a lot that we can all learn from and incorporate into our government processes of assessing safety of chemicals.
I haven't read it from front to back. Actually, I've just read the back, as you may have seen. But from what I understand, I'm assuming it is proposing recommendations that would allow the EPA and IRIS to operate in a way that would not require a kind of constant follow-up assessment by NAS with respect to each specific chemical or toxic substance that was being assessed. And I'm nervous about your recommendation on that, because I'm worried that you're proposing adding more steps into a process with the potential to kind of just drag the whole thing down and further contribute to the delay that's so frustrating for so many people, particularly when it comes to the issue of the worst of the worst. I mean, I keep hearing this phrase. I heard it in the other committee I served on in the last term when we were looking at the Toxic Substances Control Act. I think actually you testified at some of those hearings. The worst of the worst. We can't seem to get even the worst of the worst to a place where we don't have to fear those substances anymore. And a lot of it has to do with this kind of, well, we need another study. We need to get the OMB in here as a quarterback, you know, OIRA and so forth and so on. We need to get moving on this stuff. And I think what this is attempting to do is propose how you can get the process and the framework that EPA uses to a place where it's working pretty well. And I'm worried about that sort of getting off track. And then Dr. Charnley, in the time I had, you had talked about your own view that the changes proposed this week are promising ones, and I think have also said that you regard the National Academy of Science recommendations as helpful and constructive. I don't see how that jives with your suggestion that we should, quote, start over with the process that we currently have. I think that would be a mistake. Maybe you can clarify how you reconcile those two perspectives.
Sure. I did not mean stop IRIS. I did not mean disband IRIS. I meant that past efforts to modify the process have not produced meaningful improvements, apparently, because the Academy keeps coming back and making the same recommendations they've made for years. And for that reason, I think that in order to implement the changes recommended in Chapter 7 of the Formaldehyde Report, that implementation would itself benefit from guidance from the National Academy of Sciences, from a group of unbiased experts who have been thinking about this problem for a long time and can provide helpful guidance.
Well, thank you. I think that guidance is there. I think it's constructive, and I think the EPA is ready to move forward and keep this process of improving on a positive track. Let's not get off that track. Let's keep this process moving. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to ask unanimous consent to add a number of documents to the record that have already been shared with the minority, and I understand they wish to add the records as well. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I would like to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. The witnesses are excused, and the hearing is now adjourned.